equitable recovery has yet to be realized, as we are seeing the ongoing social and economic pandemic recovery to be uneven at best. BIPOC and rural communities are still grappling with the impacts of COVID-19, and at the same time, they're continuing to deal with the risk and impacts brought about by climate change. And when I talk about climate change, I'm talking about the really bread and butter issues: access to clean and reliable drinking water, access to insulated and affordable homes that protect people from extreme heat and air pollution, good paying jobs that don't put people at risk, and access to healthcare as more and more of us and people, in our BIPOC and rural communities are experiencing the effects of climate change. This is really a moment for our sector to be bold by supporting and resourcing our frontline communities so that they can secure a healthy and climate resilient future. And we are tremendously grateful to our speakers, Grace Anderson, Angela Mooney Darcy, Laura Tillman, and Kai-Ying Hang for joining us for this timely conversation. They will help paint the way in how our sector can be a better partner with our frontline communities as we collectively seek a climate resilient and just future. And before I pass the virtual mic to my co-moderator, Caitlin Brunt, we want to know who you are. So please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your pronouns, your organization, and the indigenous land in which you're calling from. And while we are doing that, a few housekeeping. This session is being recorded and live captions are enabled. You can turn on the captions by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen. So in addition to sharing who you are, if you have not gotten a chance to share in the chat box, we would also like to learn about your current grant-making practices in this space. And I'll have Samaya, our amazing tech support for this session, to share a poll that will be showing up on your screen or in the chat box. The first poll is approximately what proportion of your grant-making budget is directly or indirectly supports climate-related issues? And Samaya, do we have the poll?
Yes, I just dropped the link in the chat, so if everybody could click on the link, I will start sharing my screen in a second, and then you will see the code that you need to enter.
Great. And hopefully you can see the poll is the meti.co or .com. Mm-hmm. Right. So we are, as we are, have the response trickling in, we have definitely more people of you are spending less than 25% of your grant making in climate related issues. And we would love to also hear, in the chat box, if you responded to less than 25, or if you are, thinking about, supporting climate related issues, what is the limiting factor that is preventing you from investing more in climate-related issues? So as you are finishing your poll, we will also love to hear from the chat box. Any challenges that you're facing in investing more in climate-related issues, please share it in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'll pass it to Caitlin and to start us out.
Thank you so much, Alan, and good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin Brunt, and I also have the pleasure of being part of the NCG team. I'm a white, middle-aged woman with light brown hair, increasingly flecked by gray. I'm wearing a pastel scarf with gray and pink and a blue cashmere dress and red rimmed glasses. I'm standing in my home office / bedroom, which has a paneled wooden backdrop framed by some green plants and pictures. I live and work on the stolen territory of the Upui tribe of the Awaswas peoples and the Amamutsun tribal band. And it's represented today by the Amamutsun, who continue to work for land remediation and healing of our earth and our relationship with all creatures. Today, especially, I am mindful of the Native people and families affected by the murder and disappearance of Native peoples and the lack of equitable investment in the investigation and due justice that Native families and communities deserve. I invite others, and especially my white-bodied brothers and sisters, to actively pursue understanding of the continued contribution of Native peoples and the multiple modes of ongoing violence and oppression that constrain their flourishing. Please take action to change this, and that's what we're here to talk about. Our hope with this session is that we can be with one another and connect our hearts, our heads, and our insights that the panelists will undoubtedly call forth, and use them to contribute to equitable recovery. We hope that you can adopt a can-do, time is now mindset, and that you're touched and motivated to take the next bold step to tend to our planet individually and in the philanthropic space by uplifting especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color closest to the solutions. The pandemic and increasingly frequent and devastating climate events in recent years have verified a core Indigenous teaching that we are all related. And this shared devastation that we've experienced are a reality, and we must understand and grieve and work through the repercussions while also giving ourselves to joy and celebration. We're going to start this morning by hearing from two people who have touched deeply into the inner personal realm of change and who have discerned why it's essential and important and what's needed to sustain transformation there. And then to go out into the world and influence organizations, communities, and systems in ways that sustain transformational change. I have the great pleasure to hand the mic over to our first panelists, Grace Anderson and Angela Mooney Darcy. You can read more about Angela and Grace on the conference website and via an interview that I'll link to in the chat. But Angela and Grace right now are currently serving as Pisces Foundation fellows and have a beautiful story to tell. So without further delay, I give you Grace and Angela.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you, everyone. Miyuyam Nosun Angela Mooney Darcy Nosun Hashimim. So my name is Angela Mooney Darcy, and I am a Hashiman. I just greeted you in my language. I'm coming to you from unceded Ohlone homelands today, and I live on unceded Tongva homelands, now known as Los Angeles. I want to thank you also for acknowledging it's a day of action and education around missing and murdered Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And I want to just take a moment, we'll get into this a little bit later in our talk, but I just want to take a moment to talk about why we're raising this and how it's directly connected to this topic of climate justice. There's a direct link between where extractive industries are located on Indigenous homelands around the world. You can read reports from Amnesty International, from Cultural Survival, from the United Nations, all talking about these links between extractive industries and violence against Indigenous peoples on Indigenous homeland. The reality is violence against the land is violence against the people. And there's now well-documented evidence that where these entities called man camps spring up, where there's an influx of money and strangers not from the community and complex webs of jurisdiction around sovereignty and tribal lands, you also get an influx of sex trafficking and murder and missing Indigenous people. I want to just read one statistic from a report on missing and murdered Indigenous women. A 2008 report from the National Justice Institute showed that Native women faced murder rates more than 10 times the national average. And in the 2016 follow-up report, Violence Against American Indian and Alaska Native Women and Men found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime, and that more than half of these women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And this next statistic, I really want you to hold because it's going to be a thread through my conversation in terms of the link between colonization, capitalism, and oppression. And that is that 96% of the Native women interviewed who experienced violence, the female victims experienced these violence from a non-Native perpetrator. And I say that to say that there's an absolute direct link between colonization, the attempted genocide of Native people, and what missing and murdered Indigenous peoples are facing today. So thank you for the opportunity to share these links. We'll get into it in more details in a bit, and I will turn it over to my dear friend and fellow Grace.
Fellow, I love that. Good morning, I'm Grace Anderson, she, her pronouns, based on Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. I am a Black woman wearing, giving nutmeg skin vibes today, wearing a black sweatshirt with beaded earrings and a head wrap, and framed by some beautiful Black artwork. Yeah, excited to be here. So grateful for NCG for having us, for the Pisces Foundation for supporting our vision and dreams and ideating process. And to Angela, I think I'm going to pass it back to Angela to get us started. But I think the way that we got here is indicative of how I want to move forward in this world, in deep solidarity with Indigenous folks and other folks of color, working to radically imagine how we move forward.
Thank you, Grace. And I neglected to describe myself, so I'll do that. I'm a light-skinned, biracial Native woman, light caramel color, I guess I would say, with brown hair, darker now that it hasn't seen much of the light of sun during the pandemic. And I'm wearing a red shirt in honor of this day of action for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And Caitlin, did you want to ask questions, or should I just launch into the questions that we have here?
Yeah, we would just love to hear a little bit about your path, Angela. Please go ahead.
Great. So my path, we're asked to reflect on how we came to the climate justice movement. And, my answer is similar to that I gave in the Pisces interview, which is that as an Indigenous person, it's really not a choice. The violence from settler colonialism has been happening on our homeland since the first point of contact. And, there's some data that shows the ecological change that happened over the course of 300 or 400 years in Mexico occurred within the span of a single lifetime in California. So from the moment the first Spanish conquistadors stepped onto California shores, within 60 years, the ecological landscape of my homeland and other homelands impacted by colonization was so dramatically changed, it was pretty much unrecognizable. And I think it's important to bring that kind of thing to light when we're talking about climate change, because often people begin the conversation in the mid-1900s, when in fact the conversation begins not even at the point of contact, settler colonial contact, but really with the doctrine of discovery. And I said I wanted to link, this conversation around man camps and extractive industries and climate justice. And I encourage everyone to look at the papal bulls from the 1400s. And this is where you had the Pope directing kings of so-called Christian nations to go forth and vanquish, enslave, and murder Saracens and heathens, right? And so that really was the blueprint for both the transatlantic slave trade and the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples throughout the world, actually. And so, you know, in terms of what most inspires me about this movement and what most enrages me, I would say what enrages me is the ways in which specifically Black and indigenous peoples continue to be under-resourced and erased, and the ways in which philanthropy has, in my opinion, not been accountable for its particular role in how wealth was acquired as it relates to capitalism and colonialism, and then what are the solutions that need to happen now. I always say that colonialism at its core is the severing of relationships. It severed people's relationships to land, to place, to food, language, culture, music, and to one another, right? And so when we talk about decolonization and we talk about healing in the future, what does that mean? It means a repairing of those relationships. And really beyond that, it means moving from continuing to fund entities that are white-led, that are essentially replicating and continuing systems of domination and control around the world, and instead resourcing the folks who experience that severing of relationships first, indigenous and Black folks in the United States and around the world. Because the reality is, though we are in a dire situation around climate change right now, for many, many thousands of years, humans around the world lived in right relationship with place. And so in terms of philanthropy in this moment we're at today, what inspires me is we're at a moment where, you know, folks like Grace and I can be resourced. Our community members have the solutions. It's a matter of making sure that we've eliminated the systems of scarcity that are part and parcel for a settler colonial racist institution. And we eliminate the scarcity that our communities face by resourcing Black and indigenous folks to dream and think together and really amplify the solutions that we already have. And so I'll stop there for a minute because I've been talking for a while, and I will shift it back over to Grace.
I can listen to you talk forever. I'm just so excited to be here with you. And I was gonna, I'll talk about how I got here, but I think one of the questions we were asked to think about is like what funders can do. And I think it's so beautiful that a funder brought Angela and I together. Like I was like dreaming about some things, and this funder knew that Angela was dreaming about some things and made an introduction in 2020. And I think program officers and folks in foundations have like a large view of the landscape. And one of the things I would be excited if more funders do is make relationships with people who are like on the same side of the aisle. I think there's always like a desire to like, let's bring together people on the opposite side of the aisle to have conversations. But I think it's real radical when you bring together people on the same side of the aisle who just like need to meet each other and then resource them. And a lot of what Angela was saying about relationships, like it just resonates so deeply because I feel like that's why I'm here. I feel like I came into this work because I think organizing, I believe and know that organizing is my love language. I started down this path of like outdoor environmental education. I loved being outside. I loved like spending like 30 days in the backcountry. I love the mountains, and I was looking around and like didn't see all other Black folks. It's not that they weren't there, I just didn't know where they were. So I started to organize as a way to care for myself, and a way to like get back to myself, and a way to like learn who was out there and build communities that I wanted to be in. I think white supremacy and capitalism like disembody and disconnect us. And as Angela was saying, colonialism like severs those relationships. So I'm really committed to subverting that by building like really strong, really transformative, really thoughtful, and like buoyant relationships with other people. And I think my time at PGM1, which PGM1 stands for People of the Global Majority in the Outdoors, Nature and Environment. And it's a racial affinity space for folks of color who work in connection with the land. And I will always feel so honored to have held the role of director there. It was a community of over 1,000 Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I just got to see people dream. And I think what was missing is the resources. Like there were so many ideas and thoughts and people doing the work, but like if they had more resources to do it, could just scale it at the level that we needed. And so, yeah, this work, to me, it's all connected in relationship and like seeing each other and like showing up for each other, and like radically pushing back against like the individualism that capitalism encourages us to have. Because yeah, my vision for the future and what I believe a climate forward climate forward world looks like, is one that we're in deep relationship with, and like where resources are moving freely and equitably through us all. I think well, I wouldn't say my biggest gripe with philanthropy, but one of my biggest ones is like billionaire philanthropy is not going to save us. Like a lot of this money that was made that give us these jobs were made by like extracting and exploiting people of color. Like you don't become a billionaire without extracting from people of color. In the stock market, it's all wrapped up in like exploitation. So I feel like I really want to encourage funders, and like I want to make the distinction between those who have the wealth and those who are doing the jobs to redistribute the wealth. I think like the responsibility is different. And I think those who have the wealth have the responsibility of like acknowledging their role in creating this disaster and moving resources in a way that mends that, not mends that because I don't think that's possible, but works to mend that. And like moving money bigger and faster, because the reason that we're here is because of massive extraction and disembodiment. I'll pass it back to you, Angela. I feel like there's something.
Thank you. And just thank you for everything, Grace. One thing that I want to uplift that is so precious to me about the fellowship that we have is because we're resourced, it allows me to show up in a much richer and more intentional way to be an ally for Grace and her community. Because when we're not resourced, when we're thinking about how we're going to pay rent and buy groceries, everything else, you know, falls to the wayside. And I want to get a little bit personal for a minute and share. And it's never fun to talk about, you know, being from an economically exploited community, but I also take very seriously the multiple intersecting privileges I have as a light-skinned, biracial Native woman with an Ivy League degree and a law degree, right? That's a lot of power in a lot of those places. And so I take very seriously that privilege and the need to be vulnerable and, you know, express truth in these kinds of spaces, because so very few people, I think there's one other person in my entire nation that may have access to these kinds of spaces. I was the second person ever in my nation to become an attorney. So that's the kind of realities we're dealing with. But what I want to share, you know, in gratitude for Andrea at Hewlett Foundation and others that helped make our fellowship possible, is that even though the organization I founded, Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, which is a grassroots California Indigenous-led environmental justice organization, even though we turned 10 years old this year, through the fellowship with Grace is the first time since founding this organization that I've been able to work only one job. For the first 8 years of my time with Sacred Places Institute, I had anywhere between 3 to 5 other jobs. And you know, as Black and Indigenous folks, as BIPOC folks, we're asked to show up in these spaces, and we have to be 100 times better than our colleagues, right? And so many of you I may have met at different conferences or events throughout the years, and you would have had no idea that I was exhausted, that when I taught at one place, my partner and I couldn't afford a car. And so I would have to take 4 buses and 2 trains, and it was a 5-hour commute to teach so that I could have enough money to eke by a living and follow my passion with Sacred Places Institute. And, you know, as context, I know that funders, even though I appreciate that y'all are trying to get away from the more quantifiable metrics around success, so I don't want to feed into that, because I think we should move away from that. But I do want to share, because I think it's pretty stark reality, is that my organization, Sacred Places Institute, our annual budget prior to Grace and I getting this fellowship, when my time was split in so many different part-time side hustles, was about $150,000 a year. And since this fellowship, our annual budget is now $1.7 million. And that's just one person with one organization. And imagine what we could do if all Black and Indigenous folks who were leaders in this field were resourced at this level. we would not be in the dire straits of climate injustice that we're in right now. And really, I want to uplift what Grace said. The money is there. And not only is the money there, but the money is ill-gotten. The money didn't appear magically. The money is ill-gotten after centuries of exploitation and oppression of our communities. And so I hope one thing that you all can take away from this in terms of inspiration is, going from 100,000 budget to 1.5 million is tremendous. And imagine the impact that could happen if other folks were resourced like Grace and I have been. And I'll stop there because I think maybe we're about time to go to questions, see if Grace has any final thoughts before we turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think there's, moving the money and then getting out of the way. There's so much that can happen when Black and Indigenous people get to work in solidarity without the gaze of whiteness. And Angela and I have been talking about the connections between rematriation and reparation movements. And just think about like having the time and space to do that without like any like rigid reporting guidelines and like no one like looking over us or us having to explain like our lineages and why like reparations and rematriation is at the center for us is so powerful. And so it's really encouraging funders, which I think philanthropy, tax breaks, we know like why it was started. And so I feel like there should be more of a push for funders to get more imaginative. Like if we can figure out a system for tax breaks, there's just like so much that we can do. And I really hope that funders like really seek out to educate themselves about like, how do you fund individuals? Like, how do you fund lobbying and how do you fund like activism? Like there's so many funders already doing it. So I think it's the responsibility of the funder. And what I want to encourage you all to do is like figure out how to do it. There's so many brilliant examples of how it's being done. And it's just, I mean, with the pandemic, I think we're looking into this void of like what's possible. And so I think now is the time to just get creative and try some things because what we've been doing so far is not working.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for that, Grace and Angela. And there was a great question from Jeanette. Rematriation, are there resources for understanding the means and ways for rematriation of land inherited within trusts? And I see Angela nodding. So how do we get those resources back to the community?
Yeah, there are a lot of resources out there for understanding these issues because they are quite complex. There's all different, land rematriation is a very extensive and comprehensive term. And I do want to name, we say rematriate as opposed to repatriate because patriarchy is a settler colonial concept. So that is one of the relationships that was severed. The empowerment of women and gender non-binary folks. And so that's why we say rematriation. One source I would suggest check out is Resource Generation. They have a great website on land back tools and different mechanisms to support tribal land return. Also, it's not out yet, but stay tuned because this year Sacred Places Institute had a partnership with Berkeley School of Law Environmental Law Clinic, and our students are just about to share out with us their report, which is a comprehensive toolkit for Indigenous peoples in California around land return. As a more general comment, I would say specifically for folks and funders in California who are supporting 30 by 30 initiatives or America the Beautiful initiative, really interrogate where that support is going. Is it going directly to grassroots Indigenous communities and BIPOC folks, or is it going to the same big greens? That makes a difference. And it makes a difference too, right? Like when we're talking just from a science perspective about land and expertise, there's a way in which, Indigenous expertise is really erased or undermined. And the reality is, let's look to the people who managed to live in right relationship with the world and not destroy it for several thousand years, right? That's where the expertise should be coming from. And, another place I would check out is Indigenous Values Initiative. They have really comprehensive documentation around the doctrine of discovery. And some of the most exciting work that they're doing around land rematriation is connecting with different Christian denominations who are working to be accountable for the role of their religion, essentially, in the manifestation and continuance of those perspectives outlined in the Doctrine of Discovery. There's one example I always like to highlight out of Minnesota, where a church, called for the revocation of the Doctrine of Discovery and calculated out how much money they'd saved by not having to pay taxes as a religious institution. They then took that money and purchased land and returned it to the tribal nation whose land they're on. So land rematriation is a very exciting topic. I could go on and on. Definitely feel free to hit me up afterwards, and I'll share out those resources with you that I mentioned if they don't already end up in the chat.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Angela. And we will definitely also include these resources in our follow-up. I think Angela and Grace have spoken really powerfully to what can happen when we provide resources to frontline activists to have some clearing in order to dream and co-create. And now I'd love to invite forward Laura Tillman, who is a director at FSG, leading strategy work with foundations, corporations, and collective impact initiatives. Laura's full bio's on our conference website, but relevant to this morning's conversation, she co-authored with Talia Alongi a report called Time to Act: How Philanthropy Must Address the Climate Crisis. And Laura's going to step us through some of the key findings and recommendations. Laura, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, and Caitlin, thank you for that introduction. As Caitlin said, my name is Laura Tillman, and I am a consultant to many foundations with the organization FSG. We're a nonprofit social impact consulting group. And my pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Berkeley, California, which is the unceded land of the Ohlone people. And for those of you who are primarily hearing me, I'm a white woman in my late 30s. I have dark brown hair and a light blue sweater on, and I'm sitting in my home office with a beige wall behind me. Maybe, Samaya, if you can just go to the title slide. I do have some slides, and I'll speak to them, but just for those who like to be able to kind of have a visual, we wanted to share something on slides too. So just as sort of background, as Caitlin said, I spent a lot of last year working on writing a report for the field of philanthropy. And the basic idea was to talk with a wide cross-section of funders. So, ranging from various size family foundations, community foundations, some of the large kind of multi-issue foundations, as well as philanthropy supporting organizations, some of their grantees, movement leaders, and folks really on the front lines of doing climate justice work. And ended up talking with about 45 different folks and organizations, and distilling down into this report something of a call to action for philanthropy. For some folks here, this won't be new, and yet I think it's important to underline, because there's not enough of us who are acting and doing this work and doing it with equity and justice at the center. So it is a call to action, and also hopefully a perspective on what impactful positive action from the philanthropy field could look like, and in some cases does look like, for those of you who are sort of leading the way in doing this work. So with that sort of very general context, maybe we could go to the next slide. And I think there's really maybe three things at the heart of what I hope to share with you today. One is I really hope we can broaden the definition of who is and sort of what it means to be a climate funder. I hope that every single one of us, and on some level every funder, begins to find their way into being a climate funder. And to share, I don't mean that everybody should start a climate program and hire someone who is a quote unquote sort of expert or has past experience in climate, but rather that we should all be asking, and what are the connections between our mission and our work and our environment and the way people are living with our current sort of climate crisis. I think there are so many connections, and you'll hear a little bit later from some examples, and I'll mention a couple as well. The second piece is that so much of our work, and this really, I think, builds on what Angela and Grace was saying, but in philanthropy, how funders do the work is as important or more than what you may choose to do. So really thinking about climate as an interconnected systemic challenge, really thinking about that attention to unequal responsibility for the climate crisis and the inequitable burden for frontline communities. And then thinking about sort of the opportunities for co-benefit. So really moving out of sort of some of our siloed or sort of very specific areas of work and looking across and sort of in connection and in relationship. And the third is that so much of this requires deep reflection and learning, but also that I really, I hope that sort of what I can communicate today is that we can't get stuck there. It needs to be an ongoing sort of act of reflecting and learning together with urgent collaborative action. So those are sort of maybe my top line, but I'll on the next slide, I can just share that, again, really underscoring what you already heard so beautifully, but that the act of reflecting is really critical to sort of thinking about the root causes of the climate crisis. And I think that's, it's something, as was pointed out, that we can do more of, and that really leads to a more comprehensive understanding of what is in sort of play and how we can then respond and act. So this is a kind of an infographic from the report, and I apologize if it's very small, but maybe we can share around the graphic later. But just, you know, at that deepest sort of root level, you see many of the sort of oppressive systems that Angela and Grace were speaking to, and then really connecting that up to, okay, so then the climate crisis as a symptom, and sort of through that, what then different funders may be able to do in taking action and addressing some of those pieces. So on the next slide, and before I get to the specific ideas that we had about, and really sort of channeling what we heard for a set of recommendations for funders. Samaya, if you don't mind going to the next slide, thanks. I think it's also just important to pause for a minute before the sort of what call to action for funders, and just to say that we also heard from funders about that many of you identified barriers to this work and to sort of getting deeper into addressing the climate crisis. And I think it's important both to recognize where people are, but also as we think about ourselves influencing sort of the ecosystem and the field, it's important to think about how we meet our peers, how we meet people where they are, and what some of the leaders in different organizations or some of our peer organizations may be sensing or experiencing in their own organizations. So just quickly, some of the barriers that folks surfaced again and again were sort of climate as a highly technical and sort of overwhelming in scale, feeling like it was inaccessible. Folks surfaced that within many foundations there are issue sort of silos or programs created that don't look across. They don't sort of work in collaboration often. Identifying sort of short-term grant cycles, a focus on outcomes and metrics, which is really difficult for a long-term complex issue like the climate crisis. Other funders talked about a lack of experience with, or frankly, belief in grassroots efforts and frontline efforts, particularly those led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, which I think is really important to understand and to reflect on and act on. And then also that in some parts of the country, particularly that climate change is viewed as political or controversial or uncertain. So again, just to acknowledge that this is the context that many funders that we talk to are really experiencing. And I think meeting folks where they are requires sort of knowing and understanding this, but also not letting this stop the work that can happen and the positive impact. So on the next slide, I'll just briefly talk about where are kind of the recommendations that surfaced. The first is about, as sort of basic as it can be, but it's just learn about climate and climate justice. For so many of us, maybe we have not identified as deep climate experts or as a climate funder per se. So really learning and in that learning, actively listening to frontline communities and expanding the notion of who is sort of a climate expert to those people who are most impacted and most affected. The second is really reckoning with and changing internal practices. I think this is really actually just lifting up calls and requests of the philanthropic community that have been made by folks working on equity and justice issues, and particularly racial equity, for a long time. So these are not new, but they continue to be just as important and critical in setting an internal set of practices and ways of working that support this work. And thinking about sort of reflecting on past support to frontline groups and BIPOC leaders, and then shifting practices. So moving more money in a more flexible way with less requirements. Again, I'm really just echoing what you already heard from Angela and Grace and their firsthand experience. The third recommendation is around focusing on building political and economic power in frontline communities. I think there's an increasing recognition that frontline communities and grassroots efforts are really needed for political will and supporting really transformative ambition to address the climate crisis. And I just would add that I think it's critical that we not forget about economic power and not just sort of the notion that, we need sort of political power. I think that's critical, again, to the justice piece and to redressing some of the historical extraction that has happened. And I'll just underline that I think to do that, and this is something we heard from all of the folks that we talked to in this work, that the philanthropic community needs to really expand our notions of capacity, scale, and impact. And those are three words that we hear all the time. But I think we really deeply need to interrogate what we mean by them and why, and really expand the notion if we are going to truly and effectively sort of build that political and economic power in frontline communities to address the climate crisis and those communities' priorities. And then the final two are, maybe a little bit more tactical in some ways, but thinking about really expanding the toolbox that folks are using and thinking about sort of moving beyond grant making and supporting some of the ways of working collaboration, supporting the different roles and moving into the different roles around advocacy or lobbying that have been mentioned. And then the final one is around sort of using the foundation's investments in operations. So really a kind of full foundation look at what do we have to move in this space and to act and to make an impact. Next slide, please. I'll sort of move pretty quickly through these, but I think it's always helpful when I, in my work, am talking with different funders to ground this and what it can look like. And I will say that there are some folks who are really leading in this work, and also I think it's fair to say that that most people are on a journey. No one is sort of doing this quote unquote perfectly, right? But these are a couple of different examples just to illustrate what aspects of this can look like, at least. One is the Broad Foundation in Southern California and Los Angeles particularly, and they have been trying to really shift and look more at the intersection. They've always been around economic opportunity, but looking at environmental equity, economic opportunity, and education, and funding sort of at those connection points in the area that they really work on. So again, it's just sort of shifting a little bit of what is included in the umbrella that they are trying to address in some positive and helpful ways, and that bring in sort of that environmental equity piece. The Pisces Foundation was an example in the report, and they're an example of folks who are shifting from primarily sort of having supported think tanks and sort of the large white-led nonprofits and those kinds of grantees, and really thinking about more resources for movement building organizations, thinking about advocacy and thinking about, as the quote says, quote unquote solutions that are durable and just versus just sort of expedient. So anyway, just again, some examples of sort of shifting mental models and what that can look like in practice. And then the third example is not a California example, but from the Cleveland Foundation, which I think is an important example as a community foundation. And they have traditionally focused all of their sort of climate work around economic opportunity, but thinking much more about political and economic power building as a component of that. And an example was the impact or catalytic investment that they provided to Evergreen Cooperatives, which is a group of worker-owned businesses that are focused on sustainability. So very different pathways, and just to emphasize that I think there's a lot of ways this work can look, and some of you are doing this work deeply, but just helpful, I think, to see some examples, and if more are helpful, there are some more sort of complete examples and others to draw on in the report that we wrote, but certainly out there in the field as well. So quickly, I know I need to wrap up, but just the next slide, I think, is something I'd like to just sort of offer to this group. These are some questions that we sourced and wrote in collaboration with some of our advisors and folks who are leading in the climate justice community. And they are questions that we hope can be helpful to those foundations and funders that are looking to do this work more deeply. We hope these are questions that you might be able to raise within your program teams, might be able to raise in conversations with your leadership, or if you are sort of leading in a foundation, potentially raise with your board or trustees. So just a starting place, but I think sometimes asking these questions about very specific connections to climate, the root causes, your current strategies, and potentially the unintended sort of consequences or contributions you may be making. And then sort of this question about what's at stake and what are the consequences of inaction. I think these are potentially helpful questions to begin to motivate funders to sort of jump in and jump in more deeply for those of you who are already in the work. And then I think that's really it. I did want to just lift up that there's a lot out for those funders who are moving into this more deeply. There are a lot of resources out there, and the next slide is a very incomplete and more illustrative snapshot, but happy to share more. But I think there's a lot that people can learn. There's new things coming out all the time. There was just a new report from the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund around honoring and resourcing Native communities to lead the climate fight. But there's also work that has been out there and really helping lead funders for a long time, like NCRP's Cultivating the Grassroots report that many folks I talked to touched on as a real source of learning and inspiration for them. And lots of sort of groups and resources waiting for to help funders who want to take action. So more resources out there, and I'm happy to follow up. But just to say, it's sometimes I think it's easier than funders sort of imagine to jump in some of these ways, and so just wanting to really lift that up and offer them as pathways for those folks who are ready to sort of take whatever the next step is in their process. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thanks for just building a bridge from what funders are doing now to incorporate that additional screen and those reflection questions that Laura highlighted. Certainly a wonderful tool to help you internally build the bridge. Really appreciate you, Laura. We have time for questions now. If you want to use the raise hand function or drop your question in the chat, we'll also scoop back around at the end if it's not clear yet. All right, and with that, I'm going to thank Laura for her time and hand it over to Alan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Angela, Grace, and Laura for really definitely teeing up, the importance of resourcing, frontline communities, and to really increase the capacity to mobilize, to coordinate the communities, and to take advantage of all of these different opportunities and investments that will be coming down the pipeline. We are talking about, as we are moving forward in the next few years, here in California alone, we'll be anticipating over $130 billion. This is a B, as in $billion, in investment by the federal as well as state governments to support communities in the way for support COVID-19 recovery, shore up existing public health infrastructure, building out climate resilience infrastructures, and all of these other investments that will be coming down the pipeline. And so we have this tremendous opportunity right now to think about how can philanthropy really leverage these public investments to really support our frontline communities, to implement their solutions, to implement solutions that they think will work for them. And so I am really, I want to introduce our next speaker, Kai-Ying Hang, Senior Vice President from the Sierra Health Foundation, to really share with us as a health foundation, how are they approaching this work, embedding a climate lens, but also really thinking about how, they are thinking in supporting and partnering with communities to leverage these public investments. So Kai-Ying, if you are on, please, I'll just pass the mic to you.
Great. Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank Alan and Kaylin and Northern California grant makers for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. And it is an honor, Grace and Angela and Laura, to be in this space with you and all of you who've decided to join us this morning. As Alan said, my name is Kai-Ying Hang, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I have the pleasure of serving as the Senior Vice President of Programs and Partnership with the Sierra Health Foundation and the Center at Sierra Health Foundation. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Nishana people, the Southern Maidu, Valley and Plains, Miwok, Pawent, Winton people, and the people of the Wilton Rancheria. I want to make sure that I do honor and give respect, not only the place that I come to you from, but the place in which right now is the unceded land of the indigenous people called Sacramento region. I am, for those of you who are listening, I am a Hmong woman, first generation refugee. I have black shoulder length hair, and I come to you from my office. I'm wearing a blue and white top, and I'm honored to be in this space with you. I have a few slides, and Samaya, if you could help me tee it up. And again, just like Flora said, these are intended to just, for those who are more visual learners, to help guide us. But if you could go to the first slide, the second slide, just to provide some context for those of you who may not be aware of who we are as Sierra Health Foundation, the center. We are a private health foundation. We've been around now for about 40 years. While we are a health foundation, we define health broadly. We believe that health and outcome of health is hugely impacted by the conditions in which people live, work, play, and pray. And for us, there's deep intersectionality between health and social determinants of health and economic and culture. So that is the lens in which we bring to our work. And for nearly 40 years, we've had deep experience, I would say, starting with being climate curious to now. I'm so proud to say, and given your presentation, Laura, to be able to say that we're also a climate funder. We're working with communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And in 10 years, in 2012, 10 years ago, we launched the Center of Sierra Health Foundation. It's our nonprofit intermediary guided by the voices and priorities of historically excluded communities. So for example, the center launched the San Joaquin Valley to address deep health and racial and justice inequities in the valley. It is in that particular portfolio, just like all of our portfolio, we bring an unapologetic lens to the fact that we've got to put community at the center of all of our work. We truly believe that those who are closest to the issues and are impacted by the issue has got to be part of the transformation and solution that comes out of our collective work together. Next slide, please. And it is, next slide, okay. And it is within the San Joaquin Valley that we've been able to work explicitly with our partner leading and guiding the work around significant climate and environmental issues, whether it expands from access to safe and affordable clean drinking water, or an opportunity to really look at fires and why the fire season is starting earlier and ending later. What does that mean? Being able to understand that we can only combat this if we can work at intersectionality. So we can't begin to talk about immigration without talking about health, about housing, about education, about environmental justice, land use, and planning. That in a region where it is so rich in serving and feeding California and the country, and perhaps even the world, that some of the same folks who are producing, harvesting our produces actually don't have access to food, that they lived in neighborhoods where there are pesticides sprayed. Their children are going to school and can't access safe drinking water. That in a region that is rich in cattle ranching, there are significant byproducts of animal waste that all impacts climate and environmental injustices. And of course, we can't forget the fact that there are significant BIPOC populations who are impacted by asthma, which is why we worked in partnership with the California Department of Health Services to launch an ambitious and collective community-driven work around asthma mitigation. Next slide, please. We know that, as Ellen said, there's urgent need to address the issues that I've just described by way of example of what our partners have brought to our attention in the Valley. And we know that there are significant opportunities here on this slide. Indicates public funding opportunities, the $43 million that has come to California by its share of the Federal American Rescue Plan, the $50 billion that is coming through by California's Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts, $46 billion that it is right now and growing, right, in terms of California's budget surplus, and then the $600 million that has been supported by the governor's office around California's Community Economic Resilience Fund, reimagining what is possible when we bring an explicit economic development, inclusive economic development, and climate resilience change. And we know that history has time and time again, right, have told us that when people in communities are excluded from economic opportunities, their communities missed out on the benefits. We saw this, and some of you have experienced this. We saw that people of color were left out in the lucrative information technology workforce and driven out of the regions of the state where the industry drove up cost of living. And we must and we can't leave out communities again. There's something about learning from history. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the center has launched. We made this public a week ago, an effort where we truly believe represents an opportunity to really build on the capacity of community organizations in historically underserved community, to be able to strengthen their ability to secure and influence the use of public funds designated, right? Designated, dedicated to reduce economic and environmental injustice. I'm proud to say that we are doing this partnership with the James Irvine Foundation. So the Irvine Foundation, along with the Sierra Health Foundation and California Endowment, has committed $15 million to really help seed CME, Community Economic Mobilization Initiative. At the heart of it is CME, putting community front and center in this effort. Next slide, please. The funded partners have access to a comprehensive technical assistance and resource center to do exactly this, as you see on the screen. Grant making is going to be core. We want to be able to resource and support organizations to be able to take time away from the office, as Angela said, support and honor the work of nonprofit organizations who are on the ground doing this work. Give them access to technical assistance, to the best of the best thinkers around how do we get ourselves ready to be able to leverage some of these fundings at the public level, and then to build community power, about developing that grassroots constituency around policy and advocacy. So when these dollars run out, we are able to and prepare to be able to effectuate and advocate for long-term sustainable funding. Next slide, please. CME will begin funding during the summer, and we will continue as funds are available. This is envisioned as a 5-year initiative. This is one example in which we believe that we can really bring to it an equity and justice lens, and being able to lean into communities to really lead. And our role as philanthropy is to help serve, provides resources to bring to CBOs access to opportunities and to technical assistance and providers. Next line, and I'll just end it here because I know we're running out of time, is for anyone who would like more information about Sierra Health Foundation or learn more about our community economic mobilization initiative, see me, or learn a bit more about our community center, community first initiative. It is a model that permeates every one of our programs initiative. And so with that, I will conclude and thank you all again for the opportunity to share our work and how we're approaching climate justice. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Kaying. And I would love to maybe have a follow-up question for you, Kaying. I would love to hear about, as a health funder, coming into this space, how, or I would say, what are some of the journey in which you are, centering communities? What are some of the lessons learned? What are some of the lessons learned that have informed your approach in this initiative?
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. That's a really good question. I will say that I wish there was some major transformational learning that took place. And there are certainly learnings that I could cite to, but I would say at the heart of it, it's about who's part of the foundation. I'm so proud to be serving on the executive committee with 2 of my colleagues. We are 100% BIPOC-led organization, at least on the executive team. Our staff, we've been intentional about attracting diverse perspective. And so I think for that, Alan, that has really helped inform our approach and the lens we bring to this work. I think the fact too that we are a health organization, but use of social determinants of health, it's allowed us to really think progressively and expansively about what it means. And then of course, we are driven by our own experience, and we listen to our community partners. We oftentimes will fund smaller grassroots organizations who might have smaller operating budget. And it is in those partnerships that we've learned a lot. We have moved away from using the word grantees and been more explicit about partners, community partners, because in doing so, it takes away, to the extent possible, that power dynamic that oftentimes is at play. And what it does is replace it with a deep value around the fact that we have to spend money, but we want to be able to do it in a way that it aligns with community partners' wish and intent and the true needs. And we're very mindful of that.
Thank you. And I would love to open this up. We have a few minutes left for this session. We'd love to hear any questions that you may have. Feel free to unmute yourself or use your raise your the hand, the reaction. Just raise hand if you have any questions. While we are waiting for these questions in the chat box or raise hand, I'd love to hear from Laura as well too. From your report. This session is that, we know at NCG, we know not all the funders will become climate funders all at once or create a climate portfolio. As we've heard from Kaying, they're coming from this angle, as a health foundation. From Laura, I would love to hear, how can funders maybe incorporate or integrate climate into the existing portfolio without creating a brand new climate portfolio?
I think there's a whole range, right? And this depends a lot on what your particular mission is and your partners and the communities that you intend to sort of partner with and fund. In many ways, the recommendations are trying to help people sort of bridge and get into that. And the set of reflection questions, sort of what are the intersections? I feel like these days, I wish there was like tell me your mission and I'll tell you how you're a climate funder. Sort of like, I don't know. I feel like if it's the piece around sort of seeing the interconnections in the systems. It really matters. So, you know, we've heard a really wonderful example of a health-focused funder and sort of understanding through the social determinants, through the environmental factors that very directly influence health. But I think it's as was highlighted in the chat, right? Like beginning to break down the silos, beginning to break down the differentiation that people sometimes make between our environment and people. Even the notion that like climate is something of its own, you know, like that I almost want to be like, it's not, it's where, it's what we live in, it's what we, you know, anyway. So this is, I'm getting a little bit maybe into the more like theoretical, but I think some of those fundamentals are actually really important to being able to sort of find and act on those intersections. So I guess that's why I start there. And then I think there's, I guess I would just say, I know we all work within institutions and they are their own sort of little systems and ecosystems, but we each have power, right? So what if each program officer began to just ask the question to their current grantees, how are you seeing sort of climate showing up in your work? And begin to listen and ask that question. And if you don't work directly with organizations that are sort of and accountable to frontline communities, and you might need to go outside of your existing sort of network of grantees to do some of that listening. Anyway, I think there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in trying some things, and I just would encourage people to do that. And all the way sort of at the other end of the spectrum, there's so much urgency around many of the sort of interrelated crises that we all are working towards these days that it can be very difficult, but it also, there's some clarity that can come with that. So sort of this notion that if I fund climate, then I have to take away from something else. Like, let's reimagine that. Let's fund out more money for a while. Think about, like, if we believe this is an existential crisis over the next 30 years, then maybe more folks should think about spending down. And I know that's not always well received by everyone, and some folks have a really different conception of what philanthropy is and how their institutions work. So it's not for everybody, but I would love for more folks to ask those questions, even if they don't arrive all at the same answer. So anyway, that's from like the very small, like what can I as an individual and maybe a program officer kind of person or role do, all the way to kind of as an institution rethinking some of the norms. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Super beautiful, Laura. And just to end on a high note, I would love to invite Grace and Angela to speak to what is your highest vision for a climate forward solution. Take us there so that we can be drawn forward by your vision.
I think my vision is one that's well resourced, and folks who live on this earth have the tools, resources, and space to thrive. I think it's a world where prisons aren't the solution and locking people away aren't the solution. We don't further ostracize those who don't have those resources to survive in capitalism. I think capitalism's gone too. But yeah, it's well resourced, deeply connected, a deep spirit of mutual aid and support, and where we can all live and breathe.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Grace said. We've, worked with a consultant recently in the preparation of our concept paper, because we really are working to raise the funds so that this amazing experience that she and I have had can be replicated and embraced by many other Black and Indigenous folks. And as part of that, we're also working to identify lands that folks might want to share with us, or additional funding for land, because fundamentally we are all place-based, and Black and Indigenous folks need a safe place to be. And when we were working with that consultant, one of the things that I wrote was that everyone feels nurtured and nourished, and it's a BIPOC intergenerational space. I also want to name, too often we forget about our elders, and really this work is intergenerational. And so the funding needs to be complex, and it needs to support folks at all different age brackets. And So my vision of this thriving future is one in which we have healed these relationships that have been severed by this capitalist colonialist system. And it's a world in which we are all artists and creators and healers, and we all feel loved and nurtured and nourished.
Thank you, Angela, for this, and Grace for this beautiful visions. And we are so grateful to all of you, to all the speakers, Grace, Angela, Laura, Kai-Ying, to my co-moderator, Kaylin, our most awesome, tech person, Samaya in the background, for making this session possible, and to all of you who have joined us for this conference and for this really uplifting, I would say inspirational and action-oriented discussion. And really want to say thank you so much to all of you joining us for this conference and this session. And we look forward to partnering with you and learning from you. At the end of this session, we'll be sharing additional resources that all of our speakers have shared, as well as the contact information that you can connect them directly for more information. So once again, we want to say thank you so much for joining us, and we want to wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. And please join us. Going back to one thing is going back to the main plenary session. We'll have an amazing closing plenary. So thank you very much to all of you.